Hello everyone, today let's talk about how US President Trump is now taking action against close allies like Japan and South Korea, starting to significantly raise their tariffs. To understand Trump's logic here, for countries that the US has a trade deficit with, if there's an agreement, they have to pay a 20% tariff. If there's no agreement, then it's a 25% tariff, really giving you a hard time. Trump is revealing his hand one card at a time when it comes to imposing tariffs on the whole world. He has successively announced tariff rates for multiple countries, with Japan and South Korea each being hit with a 25% tariff by the US. South Korea's tariff rate, just like what the US initially announced in early April, is also 25%. Japan's rate was even raised by 1 percentage point, going from the previously mentioned 24% up to 25%. Most people interpret this as Trump further ramping up pressure on Japan and South Korea, and also as a show for other countries. But I think this isn't just about pressure, it could easily become the final solution. At the same time, Trump signed an executive order extending the effective date for the so-called reciprocal tariffs to August 1st, instead of the originally planned July 9th. So far, 14 countries have received notification letters from Trump. These letters hint there's still room for negotiation, but warn that if these countries retaliate, the US will respond with equivalent increases. Trump revealed his version of the truth. On social media, he posted letters he wrote to Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba Myo and South Korean President Lee Jae-myung, stating that starting from the 8th, the US will impose a 25% tariff on imports from Japan and South Korea. The content of the two letters is almost identical. Trump basically just copied and pasted, changed the name, and sent them out. In the letters, he states that the new tariffs will be separate from existing industry tariffs, such as those on cars, steel, and aluminum. This means they won't be stacked on top of previously announced industry tariffs. For example, the tariff on Japanese cars will remain at 25%, not 25% on top of the existing car tariff, which would have made it 50%. Trump said, "Please understand that the 25% tariff rate is still far below the level needed to eliminate the trade deficit between our countries." He also warned that if you decide to raise tariffs on the US, no matter by how much, it will be added on top of the 25% tariff we are imposing. Trump also gave Japan and South Korea some leeway to reach a trade agreement before August. In his letter, he said that if the other side is willing to open up their markets and remove tariff barriers against the US, America might reconsider this decision. He said, "As you know, if your country or companies within your country decide to build or manufacture products in the United States, we will not impose tariffs on these products. In fact, we will do everything possible to approve them quickly, professionally, and routinely. In other words, it will only take a few weeks." Matthew Goodman, director of the Green Economy Research Center at the U.S. Foreign Affairs Committee, told Nikkei Asia Review that Japan is America's most important ally in Asia, and he can't quite understand. Why does Trump still choose to threaten key allies with tariffs in this way? He said the only comforting thing is that this is just a letter and the tariffs haven't actually been implemented yet. There's still a chance to reach a negotiated solution before August 1st. Goodman said that Trump chose to delay the tariff implementation date from July 9th partly to avoid a sharp reaction in the financial markets. If such financial turmoil were to occur, many American companies and some of their supporters would be dissatisfied. Wendy Cutler, deputy director of the Asia Society Policy Institute, said that it's disappointing for Trump to raise tariffs on two of America's closest allies, but there's still a chance to achieve a breakthrough through negotiations. Although the news is disappointing, it doesn't mean everything is set in stone. Japan reacted strongly to Trump's decision to impose a 25% tariff. On July 8th, the Japanese government held a comprehensive countermeasures meeting regarding the U.S. tariff measures to discuss how to respond. At the meeting, Japanese Prime Minister Kishida responded to the U.S. actions. He expressed deep regret over the U.S. announcement to impose additional tariffs. The Japanese government did not easily compromise during the difficult negotiations, voiced the necessary demands, and protected what needed to be protected. The tariffs are set to take effect on August 1st, which means the negotiation deadline has been extended, and Japan will continue to negotiate with the United States. Earlier, Trump repeatedly complained that Japan was not importing enough cars from the U.S., and even refused a simple request to import American rice. Japan rejected this, and Trump said he was disappointed with Japan on trade issues. He said this was extremely unfair, but those days are over now. During the voting period, the Japanese government repeatedly called on the U.S. to fully exempt Japanese cars from tariffs, but at the same time made it clear that it would not sacrifice the interests of its domestic farmers in exchange for tariff reductions. According to Asian Review, Trump threatened to further increase tariffs on Japan to put more pressure on them, as revealed by a White House official on July 2. The Trump administration has already decided to put negotiations with Japan on hold and will instead prioritize talks with other trading partners, including India. South Korea's response to the U.S. move has been relatively mild. On the afternoon of July 8, the South Korean presidential office held an emergency strategy meeting, and the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy also stated that, in order to eliminate uncertainty as soon as possible, they would speed up negotiations with the U.S. in the remaining time and strive to achieve mutually beneficial results. The South Korean Ministry of Trade also proposed to promote domestic institutional reforms and optimize the regulatory system in order to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with South Korea. On the night of July 7, Trump also announced that most of the tariff plans for other countries would be slightly reduced compared to the reciprocal tariffs announced in April, particularly for several major Asian countries. Thailand's tariff rate is 30%, same as previously stated. Cambodia's is 36%, clearly lower than the 49% mentioned before. Indonesia's is 32%, unchanged. Malaysia's is 25%, 1 percentage point higher than the 24% mentioned before. According to internal EU sources, the EU will not receive a tariff notification from the United States. Reports say the EU has given up hope of reaching a comprehensive trade agreement and is currently weighing whether to move quickly. So, is it better to sign an agreement now or keep negotiating for better terms? Although Trump's tariff rates may seem arbitrary, there's actually a self-serving internal logic behind them. To make sense of it, you have to look at things from Trump's perspective. First, Trump's idea of reciprocal tariffs is aimed at America's trade deficit. The higher the trade deficit the U.S. has with a country, the more tariffs America will impose on that country. Second, per agreements, China is a special case. The U.S. doesn't want other countries to follow, because only China can counter U.S. tariffs. Currently, the U.S. imposes a 10% reciprocal tariff on Chinese goods, plus an additional 20%, a differentiated tariff, totaling 30% tariffs on Chinese goods. And China imposes a 10% tariff on American goods, adding extra tariffs on U.S. agricultural products and energy like coal, liquefied natural gas, chicken, horse meat, rice, and cotton. Including the initial 10%, these total 25% tariffs. For large displacement vehicles, soybeans, pork, beef, seafood, fruits, and vegetables, the cumulative tariff is 20%. The taxes that the U.S. imposes on energy and agricultural products exported to China are extremely heavy. Plus, since these products are highly replaceable, sales to China have dropped significantly as a result. Thirdly, after reaching agreements with countries that have trade surpluses with the U.S., like the UK, the U.S. still unilaterally imposes a 10% tariff on the UK. For these countries with a trade surplus with the U.S., America is really shameless. So, similar countries like Australia and Singapore aren't in a hurry to negotiate with the U.S., because America won't lower their tariffs below 10% anyway. Fourth, for those countries with which the U.S. has a large trade deficit, the most typical example being Vietnam, the U.S. has already reached an agreement, setting a good precedent. Originally, the U.S. imposed a 46% tariff on Vietnam, but after the agreement, it was reduced to a 20% tariff. But Vietnam, on the other hand, has to fully open its market, allowing American goods to enter Vietnam with zero tariffs. In other words, for countries with which the U.S. has a trade deficit, the U.S. will at least charge them a 20% tariff. They have to let American goods in at zero tariff. So, under Trump's negotiation tactics, charging Japan and South Korea a 25% tariff is quite favorable to them. This is the special rate for close allies. Their terms shouldn't be better than those of Vietnam or South Korea, who are willing to reach an agreement with the U.S. So, negotiating with the U.S. will likely make it very difficult to get a good deal. The terms not yet offered are basically the Vietnam model at most. They might reduce your tariffs by another 5%, down to 20%. But at the same time, they want you to open up your market significantly. Are they really willing to do that? Especially since Japan's agricultural lobby is extremely powerful, how could they possibly open up the rice market? So, the earlier comment that Trump announcing tariffs doesn't mean everything is set in stone. I actually think Trump's hand is already very hard to change, or maybe Japan simply doesn't have the strength to change things. Looking at the current influence of these major powers on China, I think overall, it's not necessarily a bad thing. For China, imposing tariffs isn't the biggest problem. The real issue is if you only raise tariffs on Chinese goods, industries will have to keep moving out of China. Any country with a manufacturing sector probably endures high costs, so there's not much room left for industries to relocate. China's exports to the US, if hit with a 30% tariff, there's still room for further reductions. If the US wants to negotiate on American agricultural products and energy, they'll have to lower this 30% tariff rate. Even if tariffs aren't reduced, compared to other major manufacturing countries, Vietnam faces a 20% tariff, Malaysia 25%, Indonesia 32%, Cambodia 36%, and India hasn't set theirs yet, but aggressively opening their market for finished products, it's estimated they'll pay a 25% tariff. Tariffs for these countries range from the 20s to the 30s. Manufacturers and exporters from these countries will ask American importers to bear the cost of these tariffs. On top of that, the outflow of Chinese industries will be relatively limited. On the other hand, since Japan and South Korea are sidelined by the US, they'll be more willing to cooperate with China. Free trade collaboration within Asia will heat up. The US, some industries may return, but since the US lacks a strong manufacturing environment, major achievements are unlikely. In the future, Americans will have to pay more to buy foreign goods. The US government can indeed collect hundreds of billions of dollars in taxes, because basically it imposes at least a 10% tariff on goods from all over the world, and for many items, it's as high as 25%. But in the end, it's mainly Americans who foot the bill. This is essentially an indirect tax on Americans. In summary, the biggest damage from US reckless tariffs is to its own credibility, a loss hard to measure. China is actually the biggest beneficiary.